On the morning that old Mrs. Bramley decided to alter her will, St. Alwyn's looked exactly as an English village ought to look in early June. Roses leaned over brick walls. The church clock struck the quarter at the wrong time, and nothing to the casual eye suggested murder. Miss Jane Marple, who was nobody's idea of a casual observer, sat knitting on the vicarage lawn and listened to the bees. "You are not looking forward to it, Jane?" asked Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, pausing in her restless supervision of the maids. Miss Marple's needles clicked once or twice before she answered. "I always think large family parties rather dangerous, my dear. One is so apt to say something that has been waiting to be said for 20 years. Mrs. Clement laughed, as she frequently did when she was not quite sure whether Miss Marple was joking. "The Bramleys are devoted to one another," she declared. "They're all coming down, especially because Mrs. Bramley is 90 next week. There is to be a cake in the shape of Old Court." The Bramleys were 9 in her number, grandchildren and 1 step-grandchild scattered about England in respectable occupations. Theo, the youngest, worked in the city. Oliver had chambers in Gray's Inn. Lydia painted rather disturbing pictures. Irene, nervy and pale, had married a solid man named Jim Blount. Robin attempted music, and 3 schoolgirls, Flora, Betty and little Susan, appeared chiefly to shriek and giggle in unison. Over all of them presided Mrs. Bramley of Old Court, thin, upright and as sharp as the brass poker into a bedroom and a drawing-room. She had survived 2 sons, 1 daughter, and an errant second husband with undiminished energy and an increasing contempt for the weakness of others. By 3:30, the Old Court lawns were dotted with small tables, shining spoons, and the kind of sponge cakes that look innocent and behave treacherously. Villagers circulated in their best clothes, noting who would have spoke to who, and how often. Mr. Cursier or Miss Marple, in a hat adorned with an elderly rose, sat modestly in the shade and observed what she always called human nature. It was plain even before tea that something lay uneasily beneath the politeness. Theo came out of the house with his face flushed and his hand clenched on a crumpled sheet of notepaper. Lydia, meeting him by the yew hedge, said in a low voice, "She can't do that, Theo," and then, catching sight of Miss Marple, smiled too brightly and asked about the roses. At 4 o'clock precisely, when the sun was at its kindest and the cakes at their stickiest, Mrs. Bramley rose from her wicker chair and tapped a spoon against her cup. Conversation died away in little patches like lights going out along a street. "I have asked you all here," she began, "because I have been considering certain alterations to my will." She did not finish the sentence. Her hand went suddenly to her throat. She swayed, made a small, astonished sound, and collapsed back into the chair, her eyes staring and unseeing. The cup slipped from her fingers, striking the grass and spilling tea in a dark, uneven stain that nobody just then thought worth noticing. For a moment there was only silence, a stunned stillness in which the ticking of the Omolu clock on the mantelpiece sounded shockingly loud. Then, as if some unseen signal had been given, the room burst into confused motion. Beatrice gave a sharp little scream and clutched at Lydia's arm. Irene began to cry, in short, gulping these voices. Marcus and Silas, usually so identical in their languor, moved in perfect unison toward the fallen figure, only to be shouldered aside by Julian, whose face had turned an unhealthy shade of grey. "Get back, all of you!" he snapped far more sharply than the occasion required. "Arthur, the doctor, go at once. Ring Dr. Haydock." Arthur, who had hung back, pale and rigid, seemed grateful for the instruction and hurried from the room. Philip lingered at the doorway as though uncertain whether haste would appear indecorous. Miss Marple rose with a slight effort, setting her knitting neatly upon the side table before approaching the chair. She did not attempt to touch the body. At 90, Mrs. Thorne looked curiously smaller, diminished now that the will that had animated her was no longer present. "She is quite gone," said Robin, who had knelt beside her, his expression a mixture of fascination and distress. I can't feel a pulse." "Best not to disturb her," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Poor soul, it was very sudden, was it not? Though at her age, of course." "How dare you speak of her age?" Clara rounded on her, eyes bright, voices a little too shrill. "She was as sound as any of us, more so. This is monstrous." "It is certainly very unexpected," said Miss Marple, not in the least offended. "I was only thinking how rare it is for death to arrive precisely in the middle of a sentence. It seems so abrupt." Her eyes, apparently vague and sorrowful, had in fact taken in several things quite distinctly: the tea tray near Mrs. Thorne's elbow, with its assortment of cups and saucers, the oddly contorted position of the old lady's right hand, the faint bitter scent rising incongruously from the cooling tea spilled on the rug. She said nothing more, only folded her hands together, then allowed the younger people to rail and exclaim, "Dr. Helgam." Haydock arrived in less than 20 minutes, having driven his little car rather faster than was strictly sensible along the lane from the village. By then, Mrs. Thorne's body had been respectfully covered with a shawl, and most of the grandchildren were clustered in little whispering groups, their grief already intersecting with something shrewder and more calculating. "Well, well," grunted Dr. Haydock, bending over the still figure. 90, was she? You must have expected this sooner or later, Julian." "We did not expect her to collapse in the middle of a perfectly ordinary conversation," Julian said stiffly. "She was speaking quite normally, and then this." Yes, sudden is often merciful," the doctor muttered. His capable fingers touched the cold wrist, lifted an eyelid, examined briefly the mouth. His brows drew together, almost imperceptibly. "Heart, surely," said Irene eagerly, as though proposing the most decent explanation. "It must have been her heart. She complained sometimes of tightness, but did she not, Beatrice?" Beatrice started, as though the question had caught her unprepared. Yes, I suppose she did. I mean, she was always complaining of something." Haydock straightened slowly. His eyes moved from the shawl-covered form to the tea tray, and then, only briefly, to Miss Marple, who met his look with gentle inquiry. There was a short pause. "Natural causes are very likely at such an advanced age, he said carefully. "However, given the circumstances, a large gathering, the suddenness, I think it best to notify the police. Merely a formality, you understand." "A formality?" Philip's voice held an edge. "You think there's something irregular?" "I think," said Dr. Haydock, "that I should prefer not to sign a certificate without having a word with Inspector Craddock. These things are best done by the book. Insane." Merrymead, the police was a phrase that travelled very quickly indeed. By the time Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived from Much Benham an hour later, the village had already been supplied with at least 4 different versions of Mrs. Thorne's demise. She had choked on a scone. She had been frightened to death by a wasp. She had finally succumbed to her mysterious family curse, or she had, whispered very softly over back garden fences, been poisoned for her money. Miss Marple, sitting primly in her accustomed pew at evensong that night, heard all of these theories in snatches and fragments. She listened with apparent abstraction, her lips moving over the familiar words of the hymn, while her mind considered with a quiet persistence the small stubborn details that did not quite fit. For a few moments after Dr. Haydock's pronouncement, no one moved. The words seemed to hang in the overheated air with the faint lingering scent of almonds, unreal and intrusive in the genteel drawing room. It was Arthur who broke the spell. "We must call the police," he said, his voice tight and oddly formal, as though addressing a board meeting rather than a room containing his dead grandmother. This is murder." "Already done," Stacey Haddock replied. "I telephoned Inspector Craddock from the gate lodge once I'd had a first look. I suspected as much the moment I came in. He'll be here directly. Until then, no one is to leave this room." There was a little gasp from Irene. "But surely, Doctor, you don't mean we're family. You can't think... I mean, understand..." Haydock firmly that if poison was administered here in this room, only those present could have done it. "We mustn't tamper with evidence. You understand that?" "Shut, I'm sure." Miss Marple, who understood it very well indeed, had returned unobtrusively to her corner chair. She resumed her knitting with the air of one who had seen unfortunate incidents before and knew the value of appearing inconsequential. Her eyes, however, were far from inconsequential. They moved lightly from face to face. 9 grandchildren, each with some degree of expectation bound up in Mrs. Thorne's new will. 9 opportunities for resentment, for hope, for fear of disinheritance. It was, Miss Marple reflected, very much like the time old Mr. Tabbit of Gossington Road had threatened to leave his fortune to a cat's home instead of his quarrelling nieces. That had ended in a most regrettable incident with rat poison and a teapot. People behaved in such predictable ways when money and pride were at stake. Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived 20 minutes later, accompanied by a uniformed constable whose awe at the grandeur of Ashworth Manor was only thinly disguised. Craddock was a tall, spare man with shrewd grey eyes and an air of dogged patience. He bowed briefly to Miss Marple as he bent to said they had crossed professional paths before, and he had learned the value of a certain deference towards seemingly harmless old ladies. "I am very sorry for your loss," he said to the assembled family, his tone appropriately grave. "I'm afraid I must trouble you with the questions at once. Dr. Haydock believes Mrs. Thorne was poisoned." "I do," said the doctor, cyanide in her individual cup, not in the pot. Craddock's gaze rested on the small overturned cup and saucer near Mrs. Thorne's hand, the dark stain on the rug. "Who poured this tea?" There was a brief, uncomfortable pause. "We took turns," Clara said at last, pushing up a strand of hair back from her forehead. "It was a kind of family joke. Grandmother liked us to play at servants, as she called it. Today it was Marcus and Silas who brought in the tray, and Lydia poured, I think, and Beatrice handed the cups. But grandmother's—" She hesitated. "Grandmother insisted on choosing hers herself." "That's right," Beatrice said quickly. "She always did. Said people who let others choose their tea deserved what they got." Her voice faltered, as the unfortunate wording struck her. "So the pot was filled, the cups laid out, and Mrs. Thorne selected one herself," Craddock summarised. "Yes," said Lydia, her eyes fixed on the teacup as though sketching it in her mind. "No one forced a particular cup on her, if that's what you mean." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Self-chosen there, or interesting. Rather like the case of Mrs. Price Ridley and the rhubarb fool at the vicarage fete." "And who had access to the tea things before they were brought in?" Craddock went on. "Kitchen staff, of course. Any of you?" Julian cleared his throat. The staff are all long-standing and loyal. Cook has been with grandmother for 20 years. "That may be," Craddock replied, "but loyalty does not preclude opportunity." "Okay, we'll speak to them. For now, I want you to tell me, briefly, where you were and what you were doing from the time the tea tray was prepared to the moment Mrs. Thorne collapsed." As he began methodically taking out their statements, Miss Marple observed not so much the answers as the small betrayals around them. The overeager alibis, the too careful omissions. Somewhere in that polite recital of movements and conversations, she felt, lay the first thread that once tugged would unravel the entire, carefully knotted skein. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with a soft snap. "Sergeant Lake, have the staff assembled in the morning room. No one is to leave the house. I'll want statements from each member of the household, family and servants alike." The grandchildren began to protest in varying tones of outrage and wounded dignity, but Craddock raised a hand for silence. "A woman has been murdered. Your grandmother. Until I know who put that poison in her cup, this house is a crime scene, not a family home." Miss Marple, who had quietly resumed her seat, rose again with a little apologetic movement, as though she were the one inconveniencing everyone. "Inspector, if I might, Mrs. Thorne was kind enough to invite me for tea, but I am hardly essential to your inquiry. I live but a short distance away. Perhaps I might slip out off quietly and leave you to your important work." Craddock glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You were present when the tea was served, and when Mrs. Thorne died, Miss Marple. That makes you a witness. However," he added, seeing the faint shadow of concern in her eyes, "I see no reason to detain you here. Provided you wouldn't mind calling at the station tomorrow morning to give a formal statement." "But of course," Miss Marple said with the air of someone agreeing to a church bazaar duty, "I shall be most happy to be of any assistance." As she collected her knitting, her eyes passed once more over the assembled grandchildren. Julian, talking too quickly to Philip in a low, agitated voice. Clara staring fixedly at the empty velvet chair. Arthur consulting his pocket watch as if hoping time might reverse itself. The twins, Marcus and Silas, standing close together, their identical faces drawn and watchful. Beatrice carefully smoothing her skirt, her movements precise and controlled. Lydia muttering something about needing air, restrained only by Irene's nervous hand on her arm. Robin staring at the cup on the floor, lips moving silently, perhaps still humming that nursery rhythm Miss Marple had noticed earlier. On her way out, Miss Marple passed the ebony bureau. The fresh scratch in the wood caught her eye again, now clearly visible in the angle of the late afternoon light. Just above the keyhole, as if someone had tried the lock in haste and missed. She said nothing. merely tucked the observation away as one more odd little thread in an increasingly tangled skein. Outside they bifat commence befelt by det coolers albania de de decent on cleaner Peter and I to me sick unbulam do real. Can I see for kick to make that day but comes to beautiful me the finding feedback kick me and mom to take. Det fast das later. Das heat the pop customer top on As Miss Marple walked down the drive of Ashworth Manor, she noticed curtains twitching in neighbouring cottages. News travelled faster than any motor car in Saints, Mary Mead, and by the time she reached the high street the village was already murmuring. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price looked up from the scales. "Oh, Miss Marple, you've heard, of course. Poor Mrs. Thorne, heart, they say, though at her age it's only to be expected." Miss Marple arranged her features into an expression of vague sadness. "So very sudden, my dear. One never knows when one's time will come." At the post office, Miss Hartnell leaned across the counter to her eyes bright with forbidden curiosity. "They do say the doctor was called in a terrible rush, and police cars up by the manor. Can't be natural, not with all that fuss. Was she quite herself, Miss Marple, before it happened?" "Well," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "she seemed perhaps a trifle pleased with herself, as if she had arranged a surprise of some kind. You know how elderly people are when they feel they've been particularly clever about something." By the time she reached her neat garden gate, Miss Marple had heard 3 conflicting versions of events, all confidently asserted and all quite wrong. Cyanide had become a seized-up heart, a stroke, and in one particularly imaginative account, an unpaid bill come home to roost. She let herself into her cottage, set the kettle on to boil, and placed her knitting carefully on the table. In the quiet of her own sitting room, she allowed her mind to review the afternoon with that same methodical care she might give to turning out a drawer. A new will hinted at but never revealed. 9 grandchildren, each with their own expression when money and expectation were mentioned. A cup of tea that had been safe one moment and fatal the next. And a very old woman who had spoken of a joke. "A joke," Miss Marple murmured to herself as the kettle began to sing. Yes, and some people never do appreciate being made the butt of one. The question of cyanide hung in the air like its own invisible poison. It was Philip who answered first with the air of a man reluctantly acknowledging an unpleasant fact. "Cyanide is used in certain industrial processes," he said. "But none of us works in a factory, Inspector, although—" He hesitated, then continued. "Marcus and Silas once had dealings with a metalworks firm in Birmingham during their shipping venture. There might have been access then." Silas bristled. 10 years ago, Philip, and we didn't bring any home as souvenirs." "Gardeners use poisons too," Clara said suddenly. "Are you sure?" Almost too quickly. "For wasps, pests, Jim. Don't you sometimes use rat poison on the farm?" Jim, who had been standing awkwardly behind Irene, looked startled to be addressed. "Rats, yes," he admitted, "but nothing like that. Ordinary stuff from the agricultural supplier. I've never had call for cyanide here, and if I had, it'd be on my own premises, not here." Dr. Kiss. Haydock, who had been quietly conferring with Sergeant Lake by the window, turned back to them. "Cyanide can be found in photographic chemicals," he added thoughtfully, "and in certain older jewellery cleaning solutions. I've had cause to warn people about both." All eyes turned involuntarily toward Lydia, who flushed under the scrutiny. "I sometimes use photographic chemicals for my work," she conceded, "developing my own reference photos. But they are in my studio in London, and they're tightly controlled. I didn't bring any here." "Mrs. Thorne did have her jewellery cleaned regularly," Beatrice put in, her voice hesitant. "She was very proud of her emeralds, but she always insisted it be done professionally. She said family hands were too clumsy for such things." Miss Marple, who had been apparently absorbed in counting her stitches, looked up with a mild expression. "I wonder," she said, "whether it might be more powerful to consider opportunity than technical means. Poison, after all, can be borrowed, stolen, or purchased by someone not expected to know anything about it. But placing it in a specific teacup at a specific moment within full view of a room full of people, that requires a certain social invisibility." Inspector Craddock regarded her with interest. "You're thinking of servants, Miss Marple?" "Possibly," she answered. "Though in families such as this, one occasionally finds that certain grandchildren, too, have managed to become pleasantly overlooked. Her gaze flicked almost imperceptibly toward Robin, who had retreated again to the piano stool, forgotten by most of the room. He was staring fixedly at the keys, his fingers resting lightly on the middle C without pressing it, as though the note might betray him. Before Craddock could pursue this line, the distant sound of a bell rang through the house, the front door. A murmur of voices, then the measured tread of feet, and Sergeant Lake returned with an apologetic cough. "Inspector, sir, Mr. Pritchard from Messrs. Pritchard and Lowe is here." Mrs. Thorne's former solicitor says he came by appointment to finalise a new will this afternoon. The effect of this announcement was electric. 9 faces sharpened with sudden, fearful attention. "Send him in," Craddock ordered once. Pritchard entered with the slightly flustered air of a man unused to being at the centre of dramatic events. He was small, neat, and balding, carrying a leather briefcase which he clutched as though it contained not papers but his own spine. "I cannot tell you how distressed I am to hear of Mrs. Thorne's passing," he began. "Particularly as she telephoned only yesterday to say she'd finally decided what to do about her problem." "Her problem?" Craddock repeated. "Her grandchildren," Pritchard clarified with a pause. She was most anxious that no one should know her intentions until the document was signed. She believed they would, take measures to prevent it. A small strangled sound escaped from Irene. Miss Marple noted, with that gentle, detached interest of hers, that no one seemed very surprised by this assessment of Mrs. Thorne's family. Offended? Yes. Indignant, certainly, but not surprised. "And did you bring a draft of this new will, Mr. Pritchard?" Craddock asked. "I did." Pritchard's fingers tightened on the briefcase. "But it's in my office safe. Mrs. Thorne insisted that no copy be left here. She had a horror of people ferreting about in her drawers, I believe was the phrase she used." Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. That, she thought, neatly explained the fresh scratches on the bureau. Someone had indeed been ferreting, but after the wrong thing. Or perhaps after something else entirely. Then Craddock said slowly, "Until we see that draft, we don't know whether her death benefits any of you or ruins you all." And into that uncertain space between potential salvation and utter ruin, the first true chill of fear crept into the hearts of Mrs. Thorne's 9 grandchildren. The hours that followed settled into a weary pattern of questioning and quiet resentment. The grandchildren were separated and spoken to one by one in the library, while Sergeant Lake took statements from the servants in the kitchen. Miss Marple, having no official role, was politely invited to return home, but Craddock did not protest when she expressed a wish to remain, "just for a little while, dear, until things are more settled." He had learned that her presence was more help than hindrance. She drifted presently toward the back regions of the house, moving with the soft inevitability of a cat who has decided on an exploratory tour. In the kitchen she found Sarah, the housemaid, sitting at the scrub table with red red-made eyes, and a half-finished cup of tea cooling before her. Finch, the cook, moved heavily between stove and sink, her usually formidable manner subdued. "I hope I'm not in the way," Miss Marple said apologetically, though her eyes were already taking in the layout. The tall dresser with its neat ranks of cups and saucers, the heavy teapot still warm on the sideboard, the small bottle of almond essence near the baking things. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's awful, it is," Sarah burst out. "On her birthday, and me bringing in the tea like nothing was wrong." "You did it very nicely, I am sure," Miss Marple soothed. "Just as you always do. You brought in the large tray, I suppose? The silver one with the plated handles?" "Yes, miss." The big tray with the teapot in the middle, milk jug on the right, sugar on the left, and 10 cups and saucers. Mrs. Thorne always said there must be one extra in case. Miss Marple nodded. "A very tidy arrangement. And you set the cups out there in the drawing room?" "On the low table before Mrs. Thorne?" "Yes, miss. I put the cups and saucers around, and the plate of biscuits. Then I went back for the cake. That's when it must have been done, mustn't it?" Her voice dropped. "The poison?" Mrs. Finch sniffed. "Poison indeed. I told them I did. None of my food killed her. You mark my words, it's them that squabble over money as does the killing, not cooks." Miss Marple's gaze had come to rest on the dresser. "You have very pretty china, Sarah. Those cups? Ah, yes, I thought so. Different flowers on each, but a matching shape." Sarah followed her look. "Her best set, that is. 9 cups with different flowers. 1 plain white. Mrs. Thorne always took the plain one, said flowers on cups was foolishness. Miss Marple's eyes softened with something like satisfaction. And did she do so today? Yes, miss. I put the plain one nearest her chair, specially, and she reached for it, like always. Miss Marple turned this over in her mind. How thoughtful. And no one touched the cups until then? No, miss. Only, well, Mr. Julian did move one. He said the handle was turned the wrong way for him. But that was one of the flower ones, not the plain. A small thing, Miss Marple murmured, though she did not think it small at all. Thank you, dear, you have been very clear. When she returned to the drawing room, Craddock had just finished with Beatrice and was rubbing his temples in a gesture of fatigue. Miss Marple approached him unobtrusively. I've been admiring Mrs. Thorne's taste in china, she remarked. So practical of her to use a plain cup for herself. It does make things easier to remember, don't you think? Craddock looked at her sharply. You mean there was never any doubt which cup would be hers? Exactly. If one wished to ensure the right person received a particular preparation, one would have only to place it in the plain cup before the tray left the kitchen. She smiled gently, which would make that charming little thimble by the window something of an afterthought, wouldn't it? Or perhaps a distraction. Craddock's gaze shifted instinctively toward the sealed evidence envelope on the side table. You think the poison was added before the tray came in? I think, Miss Marple said, resuming her seat and picking up her knitting, that we must be very careful to distinguish between what is naturally likely and what has been arranged to appear so. Human beings can be quite inventive when they wish to direct blame elsewhere, especially when there is money involved. The inspector stared at her for a moment, then turned on his heel and strode toward the kitchen. The line of investigation subtly but decisively altered. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently in the heavy silence that followed. Somewhere in the house she felt someone had just realised that a very small mistake had been made. Small enough to pass unnoticed by most eyes, but large enough to unravel a milkernut's entire plan if looked at from the right angle. The note in Inspector Craddock's hand seemed to throb with significance, though it contained so few words. Irene sat very still, her fingers twisting the handle of her handbag until leather creaked. I didn't ask for this, she said suddenly, the words bursting out as if forced. She sent for me yesterday, said she wanted to save something sensible from the wreckage. I thought she meant a few pieces of furniture, perhaps a small allowance. I had no idea about any joke or inheritance or... Her voice broke. Jim shifted uncomfortably at her side. She told me a bit, he said, his slowish country voice apologetic. Said city folk had made a mess of things. Said she meant Irene to have the responsibility of decency, whatever that meant. I told her it weren't my business to interfere with family matters. It would have been very much your business, Clara said sharply, if she'd left everything to Irene and nothing to the rest of us. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. I wonder, she murmured, apparently to herself, whether money was really the chief point. Elderly ladies often speak in terms of jokes when they mean moral lessons. My own cousin Letitia, for instance, thought it an excellent jest to leave her pearls to the niece who'd always said she hated jewellery, on the grounds that it would do her good. Inspector Craddock folded the note carefully. Until we know the terms of the missing will, we can only speculate. For now, we have several important facts. The poison was almost certainly placed in the plain cup in the kitchen, by someone familiar with Mrs. Thorne's habits. The will has been removed from her bureau, and Mrs. Thorne had recently conducted private interviews with each of you. And wrote to me, Irene whispered, in a way that's made everyone hate me. Not hate, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, but circumstances do encourage unkind thoughts. Human nature is so very much like that. Craddock straightened. I'll need statements from each of you separately. For tonight you will all remain at Ashworth Manor. Sergeant Lake will stay here. I'll arrange for constables to be posted at the entrances. No one is to go rifling through desks or attics. We'll search the house systematically in the morning. There was a murmur of subdued protest, quickly stilled by his expression. The formal questioning took the better part of the evening, conducted in the small parlour while the others awaited in the drawing-room under Sergeant Lake's watchful eye. The house, for all its size, began to feel airless and crowded, its corridors suddenly suspect, its closed doors hinting at concealed knowledge. When at last Miss Marple was shown to the guest-room that had been hastily prepared for her, she moved with the unhurried calm of someone used to strange houses and darker Nights. The single electric lamp cast a pool of yellow light over the narrow bed and the floral wallpaper, whose roses now seemed overblown and faintly sinister. She did not undress at once, but sat by the window looking down to the gravel drive, where a constable's figure could just be made out but pacing back and forth. Somewhere below, in the servants' quarters, a door banged and a voice muttered. The house was absorbing its shock, settling into uneasy stillness. It was nearly midnight when the second disturbance came. A sharp, splintering sound echoed faintly up the staircase, a sound of wood protesting. Miss Marple rose, her movements careful but surprisingly swift for her age, and opened her bedroom door a crack. Voices followed. A man's low oath, another, sharper exclamation, and then Sergeant Lake's unmistakable bark. Within minutes, the corridor outside her room was alive with hurried footsteps. Miss Marple stepped out just as Inspector Craddock, hastily summoned back from the station, arrived on the landing, coat thrown over his evening clothes. "The study," Lake reported tersely. "We caught someone forcing the locked cupboard. Not staff. Family." They went down together, Miss Marple unobtrusively at the rear. In the study, the scene was oddly reminiscent of the afternoons. Lamplight pooling on polished wood, strained faces, the sense of something irrevocable having occurred. The locked cupboard by the fireplace now showed an ugly splinter along its edge, where a chisel had been applied, and standing beside it, pale but defiant, chisel still in hand, was Arthur. Craddock's voice was very quiet. "Looking for something, Mr. Thorne?" Arthur swallowed. His hand, Miss Marple noticed, went automatically, not to his pocket watch this time, but to the inside pocket of his jacket, where something thin and folded made a telltale outline against the fabric. Whatever Mrs. Thorne's joke had been, it was clear someone was no longer prepared to wait for the punchline. Inspector Craddock's decision to conduct individual interviews produced, at first, more heat than light. Each grandchild insisted on their own innocence while providing pointed suggestions as to who might be guilty. Yet as the hours wore on and the summer light outside the mullioned windows began to soften toward evening, a certain pattern, ragged, incomplete, began to emerge. Arthur's account of his time in the kitchen was halting and defensive. He admitted handling the plain cup, but insisted his concern had been purely ceremonial. "It was grandmother's 90th birthday," he said indignantly. "I simply wanted everything to be perfect." Lydia, questioned about the thimble, clung to her earlier explanation. She fidgeted when nervous, she touched objects without thinking. "I probably picked it up and set it down without noticing," she repeated. "I do that all the time when I'm tetching." Irene's statement, by contrast, remained simple and consistent. She had not left the drawing room after her arrival. She had no idea where cyanide might be found. She had not yet decided whether to accept the trusteeship her grandmother had forced upon her. If anything, her fear of that responsibility seemed genuine enough to Miss Marple, though fear, she knew, could push people in very different directions. It was during Robin's turn that the first real crack appeared in the carefully arranged picture. "You said earlier you were by the piano throughout the tea," Craddock reminded him. "You claimed you could see everyone who approached your grandmother's chair." Robin shifted uncomfortably on the edge of his seat. Up close, Miss Marple observed, the boy's usual air of casual charm had slipped. He looked suddenly much younger, almost frightened. "I was there most of the time," he muttered. "But not all. I went to the sideboard for a drink at one point." "How long were you away from the piano?" Craddock pressed. "Half a minute. A minute? I don't know. Your grandmother was talking, everyone was laughing, nervously." He trailed off, then added with sudden bitterness, "You don't understand what it's like, Inspector, to know you're only interesting to your grandmother when you're in trouble." "Still," Craddock persisted, "you said you could see everyone, but you've just admitted there was at least one interval when your attention and position changed. Is there anything else you failed to mention?" Robin hesitated, then glanced almost involuntarily at Philip, who was standing near the doorway. It was brief, but Miss Marple noted it with quiet interest. "Philip moved towards the window while grandmother was talking," Robin said reluctantly. "I thought he was just bored. He stood by the curtains, near where Aunt Lydia had been sitting earlier. That's all." Philip's calm, precise expression did not falter as Craddock turned toward him. "I stretch my legs, yes," he said evenly. "I'd been sitting too long. That hardly implicates me in murder." Miss Marple's fingers continued their steady motion with the knitting needles, but her thoughts were moving more quickly. "It is a curious thing," she remarked mildly, "how people remember movement in a room. One recalls Arthur in the kitchen, Another Lydia by the window. A third Philip by the curtains. Very natural, of course. But I wonder who noticed who was standing still. Standing still, Craddock repeated. Yes, dear. In my experience, the person who moves least, who keeps to the edges, is often the one we should watch most closely. Those in emotion draw attention. Those at rest tend to disappear, particularly if they're used to being invisible. Her gaze drifted, apparently aimlessly, toward Marcus, who sat alone on the settee, his usually close companion, Silas, now standing at the window. It was a subtle shift in their usual formation, but one Miss Marple found most intriguing. The twins, so often a single unit in the family's perception, had separated at the very moment everyone's attention was elsewhere. Before Craddock could pursue this line of thought, Sergeant Lake entered the room with the subdued haste of a man bearing unwelcome news. "Inspector," he said quietly, "you'd better come to the library. There's been another development." The words settled over the room like a fresh layer of frost. Miss Marple set her knitting down with careful precision, her pale blue eyes meeting Craddock's for a brief understanding moment. Another development, in a house already thick with tension and suspicion, rarely meant anything good. They followed Sergeant Lake down the panelled corridors of the library, where the heavy scent of leather and old paper mingled with something sharper, the unmistakable tang of fear. On the rug before the writing desk lay Eualus, very still, his long frame awkwardly sprawled, as if he had fallen without attempting to break his fall. "Doctor, Hey, Dr. Cole," summoned once more from his surgery, knelt beside the body, his examination swift and professional. After a moment he straightened, his face sober. "Dead," he said quietly. "And I'm afraid, Inspector, that this time there's very little doubt this makes 2 murders in one afternoon." By the time Inspector Craddock concluded the last of the interrogations, the light outside Mrs. Thorne's sitting room had thinned into a pale autumnal grey. It seemed somehow inappropriate that the day should still be that same mild Tuesday, when inside the house time felt as though it had been stretched and twisted into something unrecognisable. Craddock closed his notebook, rubbing his forehead with weary fingers. "We'll suspend formal questioning for now," he announced. "No one is to leave the house until further notice. I'll have a constable posted at the gate. Tomorrow we'll go over your statements again, more carefully." The family drifted back toward the main drawing room in small, fracturing groups. Conversation was limited to curt, practical exchanges about supper, telephone calls, and sleeping arrangements. The more intimate discussions, the whispered recriminations, the hastily constructed alibis, were kept for corners and corridors and the narrow landing outside the bedrooms. Miss Marple, who had taken her tea and a modest ham sandwich at the bottom small table in the morning room, declined the Thornes' offer of a guest room. "Dear me, no," she said with her customary mildness. "I am sure the vicar's wife will worry if I don't appear this evening. Besides, I dare say you will all rest better knowing good. There is one fewer person under this roof." Inspector Craddock insisted on escorting her to the front steps himself. "I'll walk you as far as the vicarage lane, Miss Marple, he said in a lower tone. "I'd be grateful for your impressions so far." They walked slowly along the gravel drive, the dusk settling softly over the lawns. Miss Marple, who never hurried her thoughts when they were most needed, tucked her knitting neatly into her bag before she spoke. "It's really very simple in one sense, Inspector," she said, "and very complicated in another. Mrs. Thorne set up a situation in which every one of her grandchildren felt cornered, financially, emotionally, morally. That sort of pressure rarely brings out the best in human nature." "And which of them do you think broke?" Craddock asked. "Oh, I shouldn't like to say just yet," Miss Marple replied, with the air of someone commenting on the weather. "But I will tell you this, your murderer is someone who thinks not only in straight lines, but in patterns. Someone who understands not just how to kill, but how to direct attention afterward. The thimble, Arthur in the kitchen, Irene with her note, these are not accidents. They are placed. To the spread of suspicion," Craddock said slowly. "Precisely. But like sowing wild flower seeds, one never knows which will take root." They had almost reached the gate when a sharp cry split the quiet evening. It came from the direction of the house, high, panicked, and unmistakably young. Craddock wheeled around, his hand going instinctively to his pocket. "That was Robin," he said. "Come along." For all her age, Miss Marple kept up admirably as they hurried back to the house. The family were converging on the corridor leading to the old nursery wing, faces white, voices overlapping in a babble of alarm. "In here!" Clara cried, pointing to a door half ajar. The old dark room, no one has used it in years. A sharp, acrid smell met them as Craddock flung the door fully open. The small room was dim, its single-shaded red bulb casting a hellish glow over the scene. Robin lay crumpled on the floor beside the heavy developing sink, his limbs splayed at odd angles, an upended bottle of cloudy liquid beside his outstretched hand. The tang of chemicals was stronger here, with an unmistakable bitterness underlying it. "Don't crowd the doorway!" Craddock snapped. "Lake, windows, open quickly!" "Miss Marple, if you'd step back." But Miss Marple, who had retreated only as far as the threshold, had already registered what mattered. The bottle near Robin's hand was lying on its side, but almost entirely full. The briefcase near his feet, Robin's cherished music case, was shut, its buckles fastened. On their enamel table beside it lay a neatly folded sheet of music manuscript untouched by the spreading chemical stain on the floor. Dr. Haydock, hastily summoned from his nearby surgery, arrived within minutes and bent over the motionless figure with brisk efficiency. After a tense interval, he straightened, relief softening his features. "Alive," he announced. "Unconscious, some respiratory distress, but very much alive. Get him out into the air. I'll need brandy, blankets, and that ambulance we were too late to call for Mrs. Thorne." "Suicide attempt?" Craddock asked tersely. "Possibly. Possibly not," Haydock replied. Too early to say." As Robin was carried past on an improvised stretcher, his lashes dark against his pale cheeks, the family stared with a mixture of horror and something less easy to name. Guilt, perhaps, or calculation? Miss Marple, standing a little apart, watched the darkroom door swing slowly shut. An attempted suicide would, she knew, offer Inspector Craddock a tempting narrative. Remorse, panic, the murderer driven to self-destruction. But that neatly folded music, that unopened briefcase, the full bottle so carefully placed by the outstretched hand, those details told her another story entirely. Someone, she thought, had just made a mistake. In attempting either to silence Robin or to provide the police with a convenient culprit, they had arranged a scene just a little too tidily. And tidiness, in Miss Marple's long experience, was one of the surest signs of guilt. The days that followed Robin's arrest settled over same end. Mary Mead, with the peculiar heaviness that attends a scandal, which is at once shocking and, to some minds, rather confirming of their long-held suspicions about the corrupting influence of money. At Ashworth Manor, the blinds remained drawn in the upper windows, and the dull gravel drive saw a steady trickle of visitors. Solicitors, police officers, and the occasional distant relation who had scented the prospect of altered inheritance and arrived too late, like vultures circling a carcass that had already been picked clean. Inspector Craddock concluded his formal inquiries with an efficiency that suggested he was relieved to have reached the end of this particular investigation. Robin, confronted with the weight of evidence and the understanding that Miss Marple had so gently but firmly pieced together the entire chain of events, signed La Horror detailed statement. The cyanide had come from old photographic chemicals he had secretly preserved in the darkroom. The substitution of digestive powder had been made just before tea when he had gone upstairs under the pretence of fetching a book. The thimble had been placed by the window seat in a moment of panicked improvisation after Dr. Haydock pronounced the cause of death. It was clear, neat and calculated, Craddock, he said one afternoon over tea in Miss Marple's cosy sitting room, his tone a mixture of professional admiration and human distresses, and yet when you speak to the boy you cannot help feeling that he had been slowly driven to it. I don't like that part of it, Miss Marple. Murder's ugly enough without being engineered. Miss Marple, who was counting stitches on a pale blue cardigan this time, nodded slowly. You are quite right, Inspector. But then, that is one of the saddest truths about human nature, don't you think? Very seldom do monsters spring fully formed from nowhere. More often they are carefully cultivated, like those prize cucumbers Mr. Bowyer grows on Trellis Lane, fed a particular diet, kept under glass, turned regular subfetal, fed just so. Craddock smiled despite himself. In this case, the gardener was the victim. Yes, sir, Miss Marple said softly. In more ways than one, the matter of the missing will was eventually clarified in a fashion that would have amused Mrs. Thorne greatly, had she been there to witness it. After much searching of bureaus, safes, and strong boxes, the new document was discovered not in any secure receptacle, but tucked, of all places, inside an old cookery book on economical puddings. Mrs. Finch, reaching for a recipe she had not used in 20 years, found the folded parchment between steamed sweet delight and baked apple charlotte. Philip Poirot, summoned to examine it, confirmed what Irene's note had already suggested. The entire estate was to be placed in trust, with Irene as trustee and extremely stringent conditions attached to any disbursements. There was also a devastatingly frank memorandum attached in Mrs. Thorne's spidery hand, outlining each grandchild's faults in unsparing detail and explaining precisely why they could not be trusted with unrestricted funds. But it changes nothing legally, Clyde said, sounding more weary than triumphant. Robin believed the old will would stand if she died before announcing the new one. He was wrong. This one is properly executed and dated last month. The law will uphold it. So they inherit still, Craddock said grimly, only now with the added knowledge that their grandmother thought them all unfit. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. They inherit more than money, Inspector. They inherit knowledge, and that can be far heavier than pounds and shillings. Poor Irena will have a difficult task, trying to administer both the trust and her cousin's resentment. In the village, the story of the 9 grandchildren who fought over nothing became a cautionary tale retold over teacups and at the butcher's queue. Some blamed Mrs. Thorne for her lifelong cruelty, others blamed modern youth for their lack of moral fibre, but everyone agreed that Miss Marple had once again shown a most disconcerting ability to see straight through to the heart of things. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the thatched roofs and the scent of honeysuckle drifted in through her open window, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She thought of Robin's young, strained face as he was led away, of Irene's white-knuckled grip on the trust papers, of Julian's halted tick and Clara's shattered composure. She thought of Mrs. Thorne seated upright in her velvet chair, dispensing judgments like a minor deity, never once suspecting that her final test would provoke a more terrible answer than any examination paper could hold. It's all very sad, she murmured to herself. So much cleverness, so much energy, all twisted around the one question of who gets what when somebody dies. Families are very like knitting, really. Pull one thread carelessly and the whole thing comes undone. And yet, she added, straightening her back with quiet determination, one must never forget that they can be mended too, if someone is willing to take the time. The next morning she walked to the vicarage with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a neatly folded baby cardigan, pale blue, soft as a promise. The vicar's wife expected and received it with a tilt of gratitude. Miss Marple smiled gently as she took her leave, thinking that perhaps, in some small way, every act of kindness was a stitch put back into the great unravelling pattern of human life. St. Mary Mead, having absorbed one more scandal into its long gossip-dappled history, settled once again into its familiar rhythms. Roses were pruned, cakes were baked, and on the village green, children played quite untroubled by thoughts of wills, poison, or the terrible weight that money can lay upon the human heart. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her latest knitting, watched them with quiet satisfaction, her pale blue eyes as sharp as ever, ready, if called upon, to unravel the next tangle that human nature produced. News of the Ashworth scandal spread through St. Mary Mead with the quiet efficiency of ivy creeping along an old stone wall. By the following afternoon the village had arranged the facts, embroidered the conjectures and settled on at least 3 entirely different but firmly held versions of events. At the Blue Boar it was said that Mrs. Thorne had been a secret millionaire, poisoned for a fortune in gold bars hidden under the cellar. At the post office Miss Hartnell confided that she had always suspected that artistic Lydia of something unsavoury. And at the vicarage, Griselda confided to the vicar that it was all a rather ghastly illustration of what comes from people having more money than sense, and not even the money, in the end. Miss Marple sat in her neat little garden, a shawl over her shoulders despite the mildness of the autumn afternoon, her knitting lying idle in her lap. The dahlias were still bravely in bloom, their stubborn colours resisting the encroaching chill. It was there that Inspector Craddock found her, having accepted the vicar's suggestion that Miss Marple will no doubt be able to put the whole thing into some kind of comprehensible moral order, if anyone can. He took the garden chair beside her, accepting a cup of tea with the air of a man who had earned it. "Well, Miss Marple, he said with a weary sigh, I must admit, I thought we had it when Robin confessed. Young, desperate, access to chemicals. It all fit rather too neatly." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "That was precisely what troubled me. It was also very tidy. Real life, in my experience, is seldom so obliging. Craddock studied her face for a moment, then smiled faintly. You knew the money wasn't there long before we found the ledger, didn't you? One suspected, she said. The emeralds, you see, very convincing, but not quite right in the way they caught the light, and Mrs. Thorne's behaviour. Truly wealthy people in old age are usually either generous to a fault or quietly indifferent to money. They do not generally amuse themselves by dangling inheritances like carrots in front of frightened grandchildren. That is the sport of someone whose only remaining power is theatrical. Craddock nodded slowly. And the will? Ah, the will. Miss Marple reached for her knitting again, fingers moving automatically. I shouldn't be at all surprised if there is no new will, nor an old one, for that matter. I think she destroyed them both long ago. The joke was never in the documents, Inspector. It was in the expectation of them. She kept them all dancing round a void. They'll have nothing, Gertham, Craddock said. Debts, a decaying house, pastules, and the knowledge their grandmother manipulated them to the very end. And the knowledge, Miss Marple added gently, that one of them killed for that nothing. That is, I think, the cruelest part of all. Young Robin's crime is very real, even if the prize he sought was not. Craddock hesitated. Do you think the court will show him mercy? The prosecution will argue premeditation, abuse of trust, calculated misdirection with the thimble. The law must do as it thinks right, Miss Marple said, her voice softened. But juries are made of human beings, and human beings sometimes understand what the law cannot quite accommodate. That people may be driven to terrible acts not only by greed, but by long years of humiliation and fear. I should not be surprised if his youth and the grandmother's methods weigh heavily in their consideration. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of village life. A cart rattling by, children shouting near the green, the church clock strikes the hour with untroubled regularity. You know, Craddock said eventually, what haunts me most is not the murder itself, sordid as it is. It's that note to Irene. That poor woman will live the rest of her life knowing her grandmother chose her as the instrument of yet another experiment. To set her up as trustee over that nest of vipers when there was no nest and no treasure, only snakes. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Thorne understood that the promise of power over money can be as corrupting as the money itself. She meant to see whether Irene would remain decent with such power, or become like the others. And now we'll never know. Miss Marple's needles clicked on. Oh, I think we may have a hint, Inspector. Irene could have burned that note. Instead, she produced it knowing it would make her a target for resentment. That told one something. I believe, Sir Craddock rose, straightening his coat. You have a way, Miss Marple, of finding some small thread of decency in the most wretched of tangles. It is there more often than one thinks, she replied. Human nature is very much of a piece, weak and foolish and vain, yes, but sometimes capable of surprising acts of courage. Even Robin in the end chose confession over silence. That is something, though not enough to undo what he has done. When he had gone, Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea and looked out over her tidy garden. Merry Mead on the surface was entirely unchanged. The dahlias still blazed, the sparrows still squabbled over crumbs, the church clock still marked time with impartial chimes. Yet somewhere, in a large decaying house not far beyond the lane, a family was learning that the worst kind of poverty was not the absence of money, but the absence of trust. She picked up her knitting again, reflecting, as she so often did, that murders in little villages were never only about poison in cups or powders in bottles. They were about the slow, invisible poisons of pride, control, fear, and the terrible things people did when they believed their worth could only be measured in pounds and shillings. And as the shadows lengthened across the garden, Miss Marple counted her stitches and thought, not without sadness, Elspeth Thorne had died as she had lived, playing games with human souls and losing in the end far more than she had ever had to give. In the days that followed, a strange quiet settled over Ashworth Manor, like dust descending after a long-forgotten explosion. The police had finished their work, the body had been taken, statements recorded, and Philip removed under escort, his usually immaculate appearance diminished by the starkness of handcuffs and the blankness of his expression. Miss Marple visited the house once more, ostensibly to return for the misplaced glove and inquire after Irene, who had taken to her bed following the second arrest. In truth, she had always believed that endings deserved to be observed as carefully as beginnings. One could often learn as much from how people bore a resolution as from how they responded to a crisis. She found Irene in the small morning room, a shawl about her shoulders, staring out at the overgrown rose garden. Jim stood awkwardly nearby, hat in hand, as though still unsure whether his presence helped or merely reminded her of a life far simpler than the tangle she now faced. They're saying in the village that we shall have to sell, Irene said quietly, when Miss Marple had settled herself with her knitting. There is nothing left. Not really. The creditors will take what they can, and the house will go to pay the bank. My dear, Miss Marple replied, her needles moving gently. Houses are not always blessings. Sometimes they are merely very solid mistakes. A smaller place, properly paid for, can be far more comforting than a large one that carries ghosts and obligations. Irene gave a faint, surprising laugh. You sound almost as if you're relieved for us. In a way I am, Miss Marple admitted. So long as this house stood as a symbol of wealth and power, it gave your grandmother a stage upon which to perform her experiments. Deprived of that, she might have done less harm. It is a pity the truth came so late. Julian entered then, followed by Lydia and the twins, who hovered uncertainly near the door. Their early-ish hostility had lessened, beaten down by fatigue and the hard practicalities of each show of dismantling a life built on credit and threats. We've spoken to the solicitors, Julian said, addressing Irene but glancing frequently at Miss Marple as though seeking an external moral compass. There will be almost nothing left. Once everything is settled, some personal items, a few small policies that weren't mortgaged. Enough, perhaps, for each of us to start again modestly, if we're sensible. A wholly new experience for most of you, Miss Marple observed, not unkindly. Sensible beginnings can be quite invigorating, I'm told. Silas, who had been quieter than usual since Philip's arrest, looked at her with unexpected sadness. You think we can be better than we've been, Miss Marple? I think, she said thoughtfully, that people often behave badly when they are perpetually treated as if nothing better is expected of them. Your grandmother expected the worst and was rarely disappointed. It might be interesting for all of you to see what happens when you expect rather more of yourselves. Robin had not joined them. He was at home under a cloud, not charged with murder but required to give evidence, and bearing the heavy burden of nearly having confessed to a crime he had not committed. Miss Marple had spoken to him that morning in the vicarage garden where we stood staring at the church spire, with the stunned gaze of someone to whom the world had recently revealed a bitter joke. You must not let one old woman's cruelty and one man's cowardice define the rest of your life, she had told him. Guilt is only useful if it teaches you something. If it merely punishes, it is no better than your grandmother's games. Now, in the fading afternoon light of Ashworth Manor, Miss Marple watched the remaining grandchildren, with the mild, almost distracted air that so often concealed her shrewdest observations. You know, she said seemingly to her knitting, for all her schemes, your grandmother misjudged one thing very badly. She believed that by making you fight over nothing, she proved your unworthiness. But it was she who created the conditions, the secrecy, the threats, the rewards dangled and withdrawn. That sort of power spoils almost everyone. Beatrice could be Altima, who had been silent until now, spoke softly. Do you think any of us truly loved her? Miss Marple considered this with her usual seriousness. I think some of you did once. Children are very inclined to love those who feed and clothe them, but love, if constantly tested and bargained with, shrivels. What remained, I fancy, was her from the habit and fit. Very strong forces, but not at all the same thing. They sat quietly for a time, the only sound the faint click of knitting needles and the distant creak of a house, beginning to understand that it too would soon be dismantled. When Miss Marple finally rose to take her leave, she paused at the doorway and looked back at them. These 9 grandchildren who had fought over nothing and now found themselves with the unexpected possibility of becoming something different. Do remember, she said gently, that nothing can be a very good beginning if you are not afraid of it. Later that evening, back in her neat cottage in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by the fire with a fresh ball of wool. Outside, the village gossiped contentedly, embroidering the facts with its usual imaginative flourishes. She allowed herself a small private sigh. Human nature, she reflected, was much like knitting, full of dropped stitches, tangled threads, and patterns that went awry. But with patience and a willingness to unpick what had been badly done, one could sometimes make something warmer and kinder from the same wool that had nearly produced a picker. Disaster. It was, she thought as she cast on the first row of a new and sensible scarf, a comforting idea.